All right, hello everyone. Another episode of Mark Explains. This time we're looking at GUI versus CLI. We're looking at graphical user interface versus command line interface. So first of all, what is GUI? What is a graphical user interface? It's the interface that most of you will be using on a daily basis. What characterizes a graphical user interface? Things like buttons and colors. We've got things like drag and drop. We use a mouse to interact with the computer. Essentially, it's the Windows graphical user interface. It's things like having a start button to load up your menu. It's having these buttons to press on. It's even things like being able to drag a window around and kind of move it from side to side. All these things are a graphical user interface. Okay. Um, a command line interface is kind of different. And way back when I first started using computers in the 90s, all we had was a command line interface. If we wanted to run a game, we'd do it through a command line interface. You may have seen a command line interface. It looks something like this. It's a blinking cursor waiting for some input. And we can still use this. So this is still useful today. Don't get me wrong. This is still in use in some places. There's still lots of useful commands that you can only access through the command line. Things like finding out your IP address are still done through the command line. That's still a really common occurrence. However, things like moving files around and copying and pasting, the graphical user interface has kind of taken over for that for us. It's still used. The command line interface is still used. Don't be fooled that it was something that died out in the 90s. Still very common, especially in kind of server administrator type roles. We just don't see it so much on a daily basis. So let's look at the positives of a graphical user interface. I think it's easy to come up with lots of positives for the graphical user interface. They're very user friendly. They're designed for anyone from a novice user to an expert. We all use the same graphical user interfaces. They're really easy to learn. We get lots of options and customization options in this. We can change things like desktop backgrounds. We can add in shortcuts to folders. We can right click and copy and all that kind of stuff. It's really customizable. It's also really accessible, bearing in mind that a command line interface is kind of very, very stark. It's very basic. We can do things like magnify the screen with a graphical user interface. We can change the colors so that if we've got color blindness, we can see the screen better. All those kinds of things. It's way more customizable and accessible. However, there are some positives to a command line interface. It's very powerful. You can do some really good things, especially on a Linux command line. You can, for example, tell Linux to delete itself in the command line, and it will do so quite happily. It's also very efficient. If you've got a big job that you have to do the same thing over and over again. I'm talking more kind of server administration stuff, but if you've got a big job that requires you to do the same thing over again, it might be better to write a script for that, a command line script that will execute and do that for you. It's just kind of one of the things I came up with for the command line. Really powerful, really efficient. However, there are some negatives. I'll just move this over slightly. There are some negatives as well. The graphical user interface, requires resources. It's going to take up RAM. It's going to take up CPU cycles. That the graphics and stuff have got to live somewhere. They live on your hard drive, so they take up a bit of space. The computer also kind of, in more recent versions, I'm thinking more Windows than anything else, it does protect itself from you. So you can't do things without the graphical user interface, the operating system, getting in the way and sort of saying, no, don't do that. The negatives of the command line are much more apparent. It's really hard to learn. Quite often, you won't use the command line unless you really know what you're doing, and you know what you're doing through years of practice, Googling, watching other people. It's the type of thing as well that if you get it wrong, it goes really wrong. So you want to make sure you're getting it right first time, kind of thing. It's very easy to get things wrong. Like I explained about before with the Linux thing, you can muck things up really, really easily, and not just on one computer. You could potentially affect a whole network using command line interface. So that's it for that. I hope that was useful. Please fill out your notebooks with that useful information. This will come in handy for an assignment. Thanks a lot.